So it's a real pleasure to have Nishant back. It's sort of like he never left. He's kind of one of us. If you don't know, Nishant Shah co-founded the Center for Internet and Society in Bangalore, where he remains a research director and idea impresario for the center, but also holds a position at Fana University in Lunenburg in Germany, where he's spending considerable time and is otherwise a cosmopolitan intellectual.
Of course.
So without further ado, he'll be talking on network, society and citizen action. So ideas close to our heart. So he'll talk for whatever, not too long.
Not too long, no.
15 or 20 minutes and then it'll be an open conversation. So thanks.
Okay, thank you. So, hi, thanks for joining me in this conversation today. I must say this is very comfortable. I was scared that there's going to be like 30 people and I will have to perform, but now I don't have to, so it's always good. Because what I'm presenting to you is more thoughts in progress for a new project that we are starting, which is kind of located across the global south with 26 different partners in civil society, in development aid agencies, in policy actors, different kinds of academic and researchers and so on. And I thought it would be interesting to cull out some of the ideas from that and see how you react and respond to it. So a lot of it is things that we are working with rather than things that we have already arrived at. And so it would be really great if, I think I should stop speaking at 20 minutes and then we can go into a conversation of some sort. So inside this quickly growing network, we like to misappropriate Tolstoy and joke that we have come together to form this network because all happy researchers are happy in their own way, but all unhappy researchers are alike, joined together in their angst and despair that the world is being shaped, right? So I'm going to take this particular room as my unhappy peers and maybe treat this 2-hour session as a Researchers Anonymous, where we all get up and say, I am a researcher and I'm unhappy about how citizen action is being talked about right now, right? And that's the kind of spirit of the conversation I'm hoping to take with us today. But before I set out on my rant, which often resembles almost like the rant of the modernists against the postmodernists, let me begin with a story. So I woke up one morning of August 2012. To find that I was living in a city of crisis. Bangalore, which is one of my homes, where the largest public preoccupations till then were largely about bad roads, stray dogs, and occasionally the lack of nightlife and dancing structures, was suddenly a space that people wanted to flee and occupy simultaneously. Through technology-mediated gossip mail that produced rumors faster than the speed of a click, imaginations of terror, of danger, and of material harm found currency, and we found thousands of people suddenly leaving the city to go back to their imagined homelands. It was called the Northeast Exodus, where following an ethnic religious clash between two traditionally hostile communities in Assam, which is in the northeast of India, there were rumors that the large northeastern community in Bangalore is going to be attacked by certain Muslim factions at the end of Ramadan. The media spectacle of this exodus around questions of religion, ethnicity, regionalism, and belonging only emphasized the fact that there is a new way of connectedness that we live in. Right, that the network society has finally arrived because it can no longer be controlled, contained, or corrected by official authorities and their voices. That despite a barrage of messages from law enforcement and security authorities on email, on large screens on the road, and in the comfort of our cell phones, there was a growing anxiety and a spiraling information explosion that was producing an imaginary situation of precariousness and bodily harm. For me, this event was one of the first signaling of how we imagine a network society in India, especially when it came to Bangalore, which is supposed to represent the India that is shining brightly in the development rhetoric. While there is much to be unpacked about the political motivations and the ecologies of fear that our immigrant lives in global cities are often enshrined in, I want to specifically focus on what this emergence of network society means for somebody who lives in India. There is an imagination, especially in cities like Bangalore, of digital technologies as necessarily plugging into larger networks of global information consumption. The idea that technology connects us into these transnational circuits is so huge that it only tunes us towards an idea of connectedness that's always outward looking, expanding the scope of the nation, of territory, of development, of economic progress, communities, and bodies. However, the ways in which information was circulating during this phenomenon reminds us that digital networks are also embedded in very, okay, I don't know what's happening with the PowerPoint, okay. Also embedded in local practices of living and survival. So most of the times these networks are so naturalized and such an integral part of our crucial mechanics of urban survival that they appear as habits, right, without any presence or visibility. In times of crises, whether these are perceived or otherwise, these networks make themselves visible suddenly to show that they are also inward looking. So what we have then is the visibility of these interior and local networks as a sign of crisis. What does the network make visible and what does it keep invisible is one of the questions I kind of want to throw out for this conversation. Largely a predefined exteriority is what the network constantly maps, and what it makes invisible is itself, is the provocation I'm putting forward. Which is why in the case of the Northeast exodus, the step leading to the resolution of the crisis, constructed and fueled by the networks, was interesting. Because it signaled to a moment of ellipsis that occurs in this spectacular emergence of the network on the one hand, and the apparatus that is set in place to control and govern it. What exactly was the crisis is a question that is worth investigating in this particular case. We could imagine that the crisis was a crisis about the nationwide building of megacities filled with immigrant bodies that are not allowed their differences because they have to be always cosmopolitan and mobile. The crisis was a crisis, one could say, about perhaps the neoliberal flatness of imagining the nation that hides the inherent and historical sides of conflict under the seductive rhetoric of economic development. And yet when we look at the governance mechanisms that emerged in trying to deal with the crisis, it looked as if the crisis was not any of these things, but the appearance and visibility of a network which was inherently supposed to be invisible, because it was supposed to be the ontological condition from within which the society was supposed to be defined. So instead of addressing the larger issues of conservative parochialism and increasing backlash by right-wing governments and a growing hostility that emerges from these cities which nobody possesses and nobody belongs to, the efforts were directed at blaming technology as the site where the problem is both located and hence need to be resolved. So what we had as corrective mechanisms were a set of redundant regulations that control the number of text messages you could send on your phone in a day, for instance. A complete policing of the internet, as if that was the only reason why people were leaving these cities, that rumors were being spread by the internet. The entire focus was on information management, as if the reason for the mass exodus of people from the North Indian states and the sense of fragility that the city had been immersed in was all due to the pervasive and ubiquitous information networks and their ability to proliferate in peer-to-peer conversation models which are outside of the control of the government. So this network society that I'm talking about then is an ontological framework that defines and shapes our understanding of being human, being social, and being political in significant and transformative ways. And when we talk about citizen action then in this location, we can no longer resort to older frameworks perhaps that draw from information societies, but need to critically examine what is it that network societies mean and do. One of the fallouts of the globalizing rhetorics of digital technologies has been this flattening effect that networks have introduced to us, right? Where the entire world suddenly becomes accessible in commonly shared vocabularies and languages, like something like this is how the world actually looks like. And we kind of buy into this particular idea where everything is suddenly intelligible and easily transferable. The viral dissemination of local material and the international commentary around it promotes the idea that questions of specificity, context, historicity, and decoding are no longer relevant in the digital objects which can be understood outside of both temporality and geography. There is this specific trend that seeks to describe these objects only through the terms and ideas that the objects are embedded in. So to take an example within network studies, which is becoming such a huge discipline now, there is a particular a specific trend, right? How do you kind of explain it? Saying that within the network effect, which has taken the social web by the storm, and also the actor network theories that have kind of precluded it, we reduce all activities to transactions and negotiations within a system. It's a process by which the description and the explanation get conflated and transform specific persons or things and relations into interchangeable nodes and lines in a diagram, something like this again. This is also a process that assumes that the very act of discovery of existence of networks is enough as an end result, thus often privileging technology as the unifying power behind networks which no longer need to be explained. This is the condition that I'm calling the network society, which is not merely a society in which networks exist, but a society that's rendered meaningful, governed and regulated through an imagination of networks, right? And that's kind of the larger picture that we are drawing in to talk about questions of citizen action. But to kind of just stay with the notion of a network, to borrow from Wendy Chun, Wendy explains that the network is an opaque metaphor. Yeah, and I think that's a really, really interesting way to kind of stick with it. She says that if the function of the metaphor is to explain through familiarity objects which are new to us, the network as an explanatory paradigm remains a conundrum. Because while the network presumes an exteriority that it seeks to represent, while the network allows for a subjective interiority of the actor and its decisions within the network, while the network grants visibility and forms to everyday logic of organization, at the end of the day, what the network actually seeks to explain is itself. So that every time we do network analysis, what we eventually end up doing is producing more and more intensive tools of data mining and data explanations which help expand the scope of the network. That the network is a very strange object because it is the object of analysis as well as the explanatory framework through which the analysis happens. Right? And so it's really interesting about how certain kinds of network societies which presume an exteriority actually come to stand in for that material reality that it seeks to explain. And because networks have become the de facto explanatory frameworks of our times, everything is a network. The older forms of community, collectives, groups, neighborhoods, etc. have been quickly subsumed under the network paradigm. The network is infinite, abstract, objective, and interactive. True, it is defined by edges and nodes and traffic and connectivity, but it's never exclusive. The network is in a state of constant formation and inclusion, and hence, even when you encounter things which do not belong to a network, it is possible to think of them as a network of things that do not belong to a network. Right? That even the notion of exclusion can only be made intelligible through the paradigm of the network in some way. And this is the self-interiority or the reflexivity that a network society seems to be producing. So what we have then is this notion that we are able to visualize and cartographically represent a network of things constantly. And in this particular process, what are the things which slip out of the network is what we are really interested in when looking at the question of citizen action. The study of networks then, and also establishing the network as a context within which politics and change can be studied, is a problematic proposition. Because in its self-referential universe, the network obliterates all conditions of exteriority, and any phenomenon is explained only through its relationality with other phenomena in that networked condition. This lexical and structural codependence promotes the idea of universalized networks which are diverse but homogeneous, specific but replicable. And this simultaneity of the network is something that I want to push forward. Because simultaneously there is a contained analytical framework that proposes to offer a comprehensive view, but only manages to mimic the status quo of the dominant power structures. So almost like Borges' infamous map, right, where that has replaced the territory, the network indeed comes to stand in metanomically and metaphorically what it seeks to explain, but only hides. So I'm drawing on the critical work on digital methods from a range of scholars that I'm not going to go into right now, but Esther Welterweder and Namita Malhotra are two people who posit how the social web becomes both the graphical interface as well as the thing that exists outside of it. Yeah, that compromising the distinction between the constructed and the natural, the theoretical and the empirical, thus replacing the very reality which it seeks to describe. And I can kind of talk about it later if people are interested in those arguments. But what is particularly of interest is this question, right? That the idea that if something cannot be tweeted anymore, if it cannot be reduced to a bite-sized morsel, turned into a twit peak available to be shared virally and disseminated using mobile applications, then that something is not only going to fade into ignominy, but might never appear in the discourse around citizen action as we know it. So strong is this documentation and archiving principle of the digital realm that the event, the action, the transaction, and the actor all need signatures and need to be reified spectacles without which there is no record and hence no site to make meaning of change. As the four philosophical question that has been memeing around since quite a while now, if a tree falls in a lonely forest and nobody tweets about it, has it really fallen? The network's inability to produce what Roncière once called an event without a signature, right? The possibility that there can be a real which cannot be signed, which cannot be reified, which cannot be captured in anything outside of thought is also the signaling of a new era of information politics. The network society then is not only recognition of events as the only evidence for change and movement, but it also demands that there are three criteria which need to be fulfilled. So for anything to be visible within the network, and we are talking about citizen action now, the event first has to be legible, right? It has to be written, quantified as data, visually mapped and attributable through signatures to particular actors. It has to be graphically reduced to transactions, actions, and processes. The second thing that the event then has to do is it has to be intelligible. That once it has been documented, it can be sorted, put into databases, forced to reproduce itself only in a language that the network understands and can be extricated from its context of meaning making, where the technologized characteristics are more important than the actual catalyst and energies that made it possible. And then the event needs to be accessible because it's an information resource that needs to be amplified, managed, and granted access to rights and resources, producing new ecosystems of governance through which radical potential can be introjected back into the very structures it sets out to oppose. But the network has become such a natural form of being. Its function is understood as so particularly benign that it is often used as a neutral condition through which citizen action is understood. That once anything passes through these three objective criteria of legibility, intelligibility, and accessibility, it becomes an action which can now be understood as having significant change. But then it becomes the only action which can be understood as having significant change. And so this is the larger kind of theoretical framework that we're trying to deal with, of locating citizen action within network societies. And I thought I'll end it up with a story from China, which is really close to my heart. I'll take about 5 minutes more to just complete this, right? So the China Central Television, which is CCTV in China's state-owned television channel, and has been central to the Chinese cultural consumption over many decades. So every Lunar New Year's Eve, most mainland families sit together in front of the television to watch the Spring Festival Gala, which has been the most watched TV show in Chinese history ever since its debut in 1983. It has become a national ritual, like the flag-raising ceremony in Tiananmen Square, to transmit state-sanctioned ideologies, affirm shared and cultural values, and integrate small family units with the big family of the patriarchal nation-state. Many critics have very nicely called it China's voice for indoctrination. Right? So entertainment and indoctrination kind of coming together in the most perfect way possible. The spectacular Spring Festival Gala is a culmination that usually takes a professional team of thousands of people, production for more than half a year, and is the fattest cash cow of CCTV since 2003. Even though the show is losing its popularity, it still becomes one of the most watched thing within the Chinese entertainment circuit. So the cultural hedge, and you get like superstars, or well, has been superstars like Celine Dion coming and performing there now every year and things like that. The central hegemony of the Spring Festival Gala in defining and transmitting the notions of what it means to be a good Chinese citizen was unquestioned and unchallenged till in 2008. Lau Meng, who is a 36-year-old migrant wedding planner in Beijing, decided to create an internet parody-based version of the CCTV Spring Festival Gala, involving grassroots cultures and ordinary people from the streets. It was an idea that met with great enthusiasm and support from the public, and the campaign became very strong as it resonated with the popular discourse of cloning or imitation, which in China is more popularly known as Shanzai. If people are familiar with the Shanzai story, I can kind of skip it, but very briefly, Shanzai refers to villages in mountains with stockade houses. It is usually associated with medieval folk stories that depict gangs of bandits who set up a mountain fortress to escape a corrupt imperial court and then perform outlaw deeds justified in the eyes of the people, very much like Robin Hood and his jolly fellows who rob the rich to feed the poor. And the popularity of Shanzai in China is incredible. It has resurfaced since 2004 with the Chinese hardware and electronics industry, right? Which is why every time Apple launches something new, a month before that, that new thing is already old in China because it's been reverse engineered, reworked and reproduced and sold at half the price in the Chinese markets before the new iPad or the iOS comes out. This is basically the beginnings of Shanghai. It's the beginning of an informal economy of low price, brand name knockoffs manufactured in small production units across South China. And by 2008, Shanzai has become one of the most engaging form of activity online in terms of people producing irreverent histories, narratives, false stories about what is happening in China as a space of resistance, negotiation, and subversion. So you have things like the Backdoor Boys, which were very popular in 2005, which is two Chinese boys singing Backstreet Boys songs, for example. Or you have the national Shanzai mascot, which is a trimmed dog, which is dyed in black and white to look like a panda. You have Shanzai TV shows. You have all range of cultural production that people use to contest the larger Chinese doctrine of what it means to be a good Chinese person, right? And the Shanzai Gala, the Shanzai Spring Festival, was supposed to harness all these energies together to finally overthrow the state hegemony over cultural production on what is one of the largest cash cow in China. So the first spectacle of the Shanzai Gala was this white wagon that traveled along major streets in Beijing with a red slogan painted on its side door. And it said, Shanzai Spring Festival Gala, pick a fight with CCTV. Extend New Year's greetings to people across the nation, right? And the website under the slogan was www.ccsTV, which is ccshanghai.tv.com, and it stood for China Countryside Television. I can go into detailed interview later, but I think one of my most favorite quotes, for example, in my interview with Lau Meng, is when he says, what I really wanted was that I dare you, CCTV, that I am better than you in many ways. That CCTV's gala is the business of a few big directors, but I count my show on the wisdom of netizens across the country. It is a gala by the grassroots and for the grassroots, right? So not by the people and for the people in terms of democracy, but by the grassroots and for the grassroots for Shanzai. We're gonna beat CCTV at its own show. Further up, he eventually says, like a rebel, saying to use an allegory, there is this huge elephant in the forest that everybody hates. Suddenly a tiny ant comes out announcing that he is going to rape the elephant. So all the animals get excited and cheer him on. What's funny is that the ant is so small that the elephant's not able to find it, let alone kill it. So there were all these extraordinary revolutionary proclaims that were made around Shanzai, right? This was going to be the people's movement, which was eventually going to culminate into a nationwide fight against censorship, against firewalling, and so on and so forth. So at the heat of the expectations mounted, the Shanzai campaign became a political quest in the public's imagination and was endowed with significance beyond its entertainment value. The discourse of grassroots versus authority, citizen hero versus CCTV heralded a bottom-up revolution just around the corner. But alongside that, there were also a growing discontent because there was a commercial incorporation of Shanzai. There was lots of mainstream revenue now suddenly coming in. There were different television channels which were trying to tie in and give it like a parallel screening spot next to the Spring Festival and things like that. When the money started pouring in, the government suddenly woke up and said this needs to be stopped. And because it's China, it was really easy. Because the SARFT first issued an order forbidding all provincial satellite TV channels from broadcasting the Shanzai Gala and sent a warning to Guizhou TV, who had just signed a contract to do like a parallel streaming. On January 20th, 5 days before the scheduled event, there was a coalition of online audio-video service providers, an NGO that was set up by the SARFT, and they sent out a notice title saying that a notice of boycotting the online dissemination of Shanzai Spring Festival Gala. All in all, to cut a very long story short, the Shanzai Spring Festival, with its promised 10,000 participants and hours of footage and different kinds of streaming and distribution online, was an event that never happened. Yeah, it never happened. There was a dress rehearsal, but it never really resulted into an event which could actually be televised at the end of the day. The dress rehearsal was eventually televised and broadcast on a offland TV channel in Macau, but that's about it. So this is where I want to end, right? That the Shanghai Spring Festival stands in stark contrast to the spectacles of massive mobilization that we have seen around the world in recent years. Like both academic and popular discourse have marked this as a failed event, as something that was no significance because it only generated a politics of despair about how there will never be a true people's revolution in China. But if you start looking at different subversive groups post 2009, in constant conversations with them, they would talk about, do you remember that thing that did not happen? Right? That thing that did not happen was one of the ways by which they thought of themselves as political actors who could actually engage in acts of citizen action. For us, it becomes really fascinating to not read the Shanghai Spring Festival Gala as an act of failure, but something that refused to be legible, intelligible and accessible to the network paradigm. It did not create spectacles which could be easily consumed by CNN and broadcast to the rest of the world as yet another iconic moment where democracy has won. It was something that not only refused to make itself meaningful to others who were outside of it, but it also refused to interact with the state in the vocabulary that the state was familiar with, right? So the idea was that if we can start thinking about citizen action in network societies as reconfiguring three things, and I'll conclude here. One is the resistance that it provides in terms of making things intelligible, accessible, and legible. Like what are the things which are actually being missed out on? And maybe therein actually are the potentials of change and radical subversion, right? The second would be that if we start looking at the history of non-events, of non-spectacles, things which cannot be captured and made tangible within the network society, what kind of other histories would it be able to give us? And the third would be to start looking at questions of affect, of what are the kinds of traces of solidarities, of engagements and commitments that actually bring together citizen action, rather than trying to only look at producing a blueprint which must make sense so that if it works in one context, then it can be just designed, replicated across different places. And there are people who actually make careers out of it now, right? So they go to development agencies and NGOs and saying, we will now engineer a social revolution for you. And all you need to do is like tick mark these 20 boxes, and if you have all of them, beginning with a Twitter feed and then a mobile-based interactive platform, then social change will happen on its own. So we thought it would be interesting to just complicate this particular terrain, and what we're doing through the project is that across 11 countries now, we are creating these new histories of the non-events, of the unspectacular, of things which could not be recorded and documented, to maybe look at where the true potential for radical change and action actually lies within network societies. Okay, I'll stop here.
Thank you.
Thank you.